Hello, glad to see you. We are the Coureurs de Bois, the runners of the woods. We are independent fur traders. We do not belong to a big company like the Hudson's Bay Company or the Northwest Company, but we are people who don't do well in the city, so we like the life of living in the wilderness, trading with the indigenous people. Welcome again to the fur trade. Now, what is the fur trade? It's trading furs. And many of the furs were traded for what? European trade goods. Now, the most important fur, as Rod's going to give us, was the beaver. Now, in Europe, there was a big fad craze for hats made out of beaver felt. Not beaver fur, but beaver felt. Now, beaver felt was made from the inner fur of the beaver, the underwear of the beaver, the part that keeps him warm when he's in the water. Now, those inner fur was barbed like a fishhook. So when it was matted together with a cocktail of chemicals, it formed a felt. Now, one of those chemicals was mercury, which was very, very toxic or poisonous. And the hatters were breathing in the fumes from this mercury, and it was giving them brain damage, and they became a little crazy, which is where you get the term the Mad Hatter. Now, they were all styles of hats. Thank you, Rod. This hat was called a round hat. They were hats that were tricorn. Do you remember hats like this? The hat that Captain Hook wore was a beaver fur felt hat. The hats that the Three Musketeers wore were fur felt hats. At Christmas time, when you see Scrooge with his top hat, it was a fur felt hat. Remember to look and you'll see how fuzzy it looked, but not like fur coat. Now, before the Europeans found the beaver in North America, they were using beaver from Russia, but by the early 1700s, most of those beaver were extinct, and they were happy to find that there were an abundant supply of beaver in North America. So the fur trade began, and what was traded? The beaver, and it was the most important fur, and a very large beaver, this big, an adult beaver was called a made beaver. Now, the made beaver was the basis for all the fur trade. A made beaver is kind of like a dollar. If you didn't have a beaver, but say you had 5 or 6 fox skins, that would equal 1 beaver in value. So everything was traded in made beavers. If you wanted to buy a knife, it might have been 3 made beavers. Understand what we're saying now? It was like dollars. Now, what was it traded? The European trade goods consisted mostly of things made of a material called iron. You must remember, when the Europeans first came to North America, that the people who were living here were in the Stone Age, meaning that they still made their points, blades, arrowheads, spearheads, etc., axes out of stone or bone. When the Europeans came, they introduced the steel knife, which was considerably more sturdy, maybe not as beautiful, but sturdy. So it became an important trade item. Everything that was made out of metal is important. Another important trade item was a hand axe called a tomahawk, sometimes called a hawk for short. And they were used in warfare and general tree cutting. Sometimes they were marketed just for the ladies, as this one is with the weeping heart, which is a Scottish design. Now, the heart was put in there to catch the ladies' attention, and ladies out there, you needed one of these because it was your job to get the firewood. Other important metal items were scissors, sewing needles, thimbles. Scissors important because they were used to make clothes. Sewing needles because it was easier than using bone. Other important things were tin cups, tin plates, and trade kettles. Now, in the fur trade, if you read about a kettle, we are not talking about a tea kettle like this, which was this one made out of brass. We're talking about a pot. Now, some of the pots were bigger than this, the size of, say, a paint can. This one is made out of brass. Some were made out of copper, some were made out of tin. Okay? But it was so much easier to cook with a pot because all you had to do was put it over the fire. Before they had the metal pots, you maybe used something like an animal stomach, which is waterproof. you would have to fill it with water, take some hot stones that you've heated in the fire, put them into the water. The heat would transfer from the rocks to the water, and you would get hot water. But it was so much easier to put it pot over the fire. Another item you might have to trade for was an S hook, called an S hook because it looks like an S. You hung it over the fire, and it made your life easier. That was why they wanted these things. Important things: metal, scissors, sewing needles, fish hooks. Those are important. People sometimes think that beads are important, but this was only a small part of the fur trade. You traded for beads once that you had your important iron metal things. Scissors again, sewing needles, fire steels. A fire steel was a special kind of steel that was hit against a piece of flint, a stone, and it made a spark. And it made it so much easier to make a fire than the ways that were done by the indigenous people themselves. We'll talk a little more about these perhaps. Other strange trade items that you would get would be a gorget. This was something that was worn by British officers or all European officers, and it showed their rank. They were made in either gold or sterling silver. This one is brass. They were traded by the thousands. Some other metal things would have been bells, used not just on clothes, but say on toboggans that your dog would pull in the winter. Other items would be cups. Now this is a copper cup. It had to be tinned inside, which means a layer of tin so that you wouldn't get any nasty effects from drinking out of raw copper. Other important trade items were traps, which were used to catch the beaver. Before they had the traps, one of the ways to catch beaver was to break open the beaver lodge in winter, which would scare the beavers over to a wash or a little track that they used to use under the ice by the shore, and that's where you would catch them, and then you'd have to bring them out alive. And it was much easier to catch them with this. Remember, where everything was made beavers. If you wanted to buy a trap, two made beavers would buy you a trap. Okay? Other important items that they had made out of metal were little cases to hold tobacco, which was another fur trade item. The indigenous people introduced tobacco to the Europeans, but the Europeans grew it on a big scale, and then they traded it back to the native or indigenous people. Another item you may not think of in the fur trade was mirrors. Imagine if you had never seen yourself except in a puddle, how cool this was to see yourself clearly. Or maybe it was frightening if you thought your spirit was in there. However it was, this became a very important trade item. In fact, it became so popular that there were little mirrors with holes built into them so they could be sewn into your clothing or your hair. Other trade items that were important was trade silver, made from sterling silver. It could have been in the designs of your totem, which might have been the Beaver Clan, or it could have been a cross, as some Europeans were trying to teach the native people about Christianity. Trade silver, a very important thing. Here's another piece of trade silver here. Of course, the wealthier you were, the more this you could afford. Another important trade item was sugar. Okay, like most people in the world, the indigenous people had a sweet tooth. Now, you can't see the sugar because it's covered by a blue paper. And it was in this cone, and it was brown. Sometimes it was white if it was really expensive. It was very hard, a very expensive item. Another item that might have been traded was tea, and not so much coffee, but tea. Now, this is a block of tea from China, and it was made this way, compressed and hardened so they could put a lot of it on the ship. It's very hard, and you would have to slave off some slivers to make your tea. This little block can make 10 gallons of tea. And also, tea was very expensive in those days. We have a block of tea right here that was $6. Now, that may not sound like a lot of money to you, but in the 1750s, $6 was a lot of money. The average person earned about $25 a year. So it was very expensive. In fact, everything in the fur trade was expensive. It was expensive to ship up to the wild north country. It was expensive for the indigenous people to buy. It was expensive all the way around. Everything was precious. In fact, it was so precious that it was used until it wore out. I don't know if you can see this, but we'll try and point it out. This blade used to be this thick, but it's been worn down because it was expensive and hard to come by. If you lost or broke your knife, you would have to either use a stone one or wait until we came by again and you managed to trade for another knife. Now, a lot of the knives were not made with handles. The reason for that was so they could pack more of them in a box. And remember, the box was sent on a sailing ship in England, sailed to Montreal, and then packed in a canoe and paddled all the way to here. So there were a lot of handles available out in the forest, and native people had been putting them on handles on for years. Other important trade goods could have been tin cups, not so much, but lanterns, canteens. These were all things that made life easier. The most important trade items, or the most expensive, were firearms and blankets. And they cost about the same. Now, the most important thing, as we said, to buy, or most expensive, was the Northwest trade gun. By the 1750s, a specific style had been made to trade in the fur trade. This is a musket, meaning it's smooth bore. It's like a pipe inside. It was very strong, and it was made so you could shoot a big ball at a moose or a bear, or little tiny lead balls go shot at a duck or a grouse. Also, you had to have a little tool like this to melt the lead so you could make some musket balls. We'll talk about this one in a second. To buy this, first of all, we have to talk about this again. It had to have a bow trigger like this. It had to have 5 nails in the back. It had to have a dragon on the side. This was the most important part, so that we knew that it was a real Northwest trade gun. Now, you could trade for this. You would have to pay about 12 large beavers. Rod, show them how big a beaver would be. Big adult beavers, made beavers, 12 of them. But if all you bought was this, all you would have was a club, because you needed some things to make this work. And one of them was gunpowder. And gunpowder had to be kept dry, so you would need something to keep it dry. And in those days, it was a cow horn or a buffalo horn, because gunpowder sucks up moisture. But that's not the only thing you needed. You needed flints to make it spark, and you needed tools to make it work. You needed gunpowder, lead balls or shot, the flint, and we loved to sell this to you because we knew that once you bought this, you would come back to see us, because we knew that you would need more gunpowder, flints, shot, etc. Now, like I said, the other important thing was a blanket, a very expensive item as well. It would cost you 12 to 14 beavers as well. It could be used just like a blanket to wrap around you. It could be used and made into a coat called a capot. Other things that were traded were shirts made out of linen and then later cotton, because it was much lighter and more comfortable to wear than wearing leather. I'm done.